Hello, 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 and thank you so much for joining us today for another episode of Diverse Thinking, Different Learning. Today, my guest is Dr. Daniel Franklin. And if that name sounds familiar to you, it's because this is his second time on the podcast. He was one of our first couple of guests, and his first episode was episode number 4, which I will definitely link to in the show notes. Dr. Franklin is the founder and clinical director of the Los Angeles-based Franklin Education Services, and he's the author of an incredible book called Helping Your Child with Language-Based Disabilities. He's also the co-editor of the Los Angeles Psychologist. Dr. Franklin is here with us today to talk about dynamic assessments. And we've talked about assessments on the podcast before, but today we're going to really specifically discuss dynamic assessments and how it helps us to better understand kids. Let's jump in.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Hello, Daniel. Welcome back to the podcast.
Great to be here, Karen.
You are back full circle. I think we're almost 80 episodes in now. Can you believe that?
Wow, that's great. Great episodes, too. I've listened to many of them.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, I wanted to have you back because we've talked a lot over the course of this podcast about assessment, about identifying kind of the reasons why kids are struggling so that we can better help them. And I came across, I think you were giving a talk on dynamic assessment. And I thought, well, I would love to have him come on the podcast and talk about that, because I think it's something that, parents are unfamiliar with. Maybe some educators might be unfamiliar with. Even practitioners who do assessments may not be as familiar with the dynamic assessment. So I wanted you to come on and maybe we can first talk about, what is a dynamic assessment and go from there.
Sure. Delighted to be here speaking with you about this and looking forward to getting your thoughts and input too about assessment in general. And there are two general approaches to assessment. There is a formal static approach. There's an assessment, an instrument, a test that's designed, and we implement it and we get results. Dynamic assessment is a little different in that it's highly interactive. Obviously, it changes the result, and we can talk a little bit more about that. But dynamic assessment is dynamic, that involves a high level of interaction and involvement in varying degrees on the part of the person administering the assessment. Today, I'm going to be speaking about this from the standpoint of a practitioner. Certainly a science to dynamic assessment, and there's a body of literature, an ever-growing body of literature on dynamic assessment. I was recently on Amazon and I saw there's 15, 16 books on it. So there is a science to it, but I'm going to speak mostly from the standpoint of a practitioner. And I would like to sort of go back to the origins of dynamic assessment, which go all the way back to the early 1930s, when the Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky, who was studying and doing his work in Russia. Lev Vygotsky was born in 1896. Interesting date, because Jean Piaget was also born in 1896. They didn't know one another very well, and I don't think Piaget knew anything about Lev Vygotsky, but Lev Vygotsky did know about the work of Piaget, certainly by the early 30s. An interesting coincidence. And Lev Vygotsky, among other things, had the principle of learning called the zone of proximal development. That's the realm in which optimal learning occurs. So when a student is learning, or let's say managing a task, if the task is way over their head, you're working with a first grader and trying to teach calculus, you're not going to get very far. So that's way beyond the scope of what they can do. If you're working with a normally developing first grader and you ask them to count to 3, that's not going to challenge them very much either. So, but there is this sweet spot, this sort of Goldilocks zone, the zone of proximal development, where optimal learning takes place. And optimal learning occurs when it's mediated. And generally speaking, the younger a student is, the more important it is that instruction be mediated by an adult. So a very young child, we want to be highly involved. So for a young child, say a first grader again, to learn about adding 1 plus 1 or 2 plus 2, that might be more in the optimal zone of development. And we arrive at knowledge about what's optimal for a child in terms of their learning capacities by working in a very interactive way with them. And so dynamic assessment grew out of this principle of the zone of proximal development and grew out of ideas that Lev Vygotsky had about how do we use assessment dynamically, interactively, to really understand what it is we need to know about a student and their learning potential. When we administer a formal test, there's often some test bias as a result of many different things. One could be, say we're doing some math assessment, but the questions involve a lot of reading. So if the child is not a skilled reader, they may not perform well on a math assessment. And so bias gets introduced into the assessment process by the nature of the exam. And in view of these things, many practitioners, going back to Lev Vygotsky almost 100 years ago, began using an approach to assessment that was much more interactive. And that is, and again, I'm going to speak about dynamic assessment from the standpoint of an educator, of a practitioner. I would like to add that there is a wonderful science and a lot of methodology, formalized methodologies for dynamic assessment. And I won't get into a lot of that, but it is a wonderful and interesting area to learn about. There is approaches to dynamic assessment to evaluate language, spoken language development, writing skills, lots of different other capacities. The way I use dynamic assessment as an educator, and say we have a student in a social studies class and they need to take a test on some aspect of social studies, but we know the child has very slowly emerging reading skills. So we don't know what the experience for that child is going to be like when they sit down with a test in front of them. You can have 2 kids take the exact same test and get the exact same score. Say 2 kids sit down, take the exact test, and they both get a 50%. But they can have that score for very different reasons. And unless we're assessing those 2 children dynamically, we don't know why one child got a 50 and the other child got a 50. There could be for 2 very different reasons.
Absolutely. And that's so important because I can think about, like, use an example of a child who's struggling with reading. You know, if you're not getting through the reading or you're reading the words incorrectly, then obviously you're going to be responding in a different way. And then you may have a child who's got slow processing speed and only gets through half of the material, but they got the first half all correct, right? They're going to get a 50, but all their answers were correct. They just didn't finish the test.
Exactly. And so if we're assessing students, say we're doing a group assessment to a lot of students in a classroom, and we see lots of different scores, it's hard to know why we got the scores we got. And we don't have often enough information then to know how to individualize instruction for those students. By the way, dynamic assessment is especially helpful for children with a wide range of developmental differences. As we know, when tests are designed, and Dr. Wilson, I know you can speak much more to this in terms of really formal psychometric tests where they're normed and based on kids who are more neurotypical. They're not normed, or some are normed on kids who are not neurotypical, and that's important. But what this means is that when a child begins to take a test, they may have a learning or behavioral difference that's going to have a significant impact on what their score is going to be. So let's go back to that, let's say 8th grader, and it's a social studies test, and this is a child who's been struggling. And if I sit down with that child and we begin to take a test, maybe they took it already, maybe they haven't taken it yet. In either case, I can begin to see where the breakdown was. Were they unable to read the directions or read the question, or did they misread the question? Or did they read the question correctly, but have a difficult time retrieving the right information because they got into a thought process that led them down a very different path? And so when we're doing dynamic assessment, and the great beauty of it is we gather information, and that is really one of the hallmarks of dynamic assessment, is that we're taking lots of notes as we work with children. When I do dynamic assessment from an academic standpoint, my student has a copy of the test we're taking, and I have a copy of the test. And I carefully annotate when I needed to provide a prompt, what the prompt was, how frequently. Did I need to provide redirection to get refocused on the test? Was there some attentional issue? Was the child distracted by a diagram or illustration? What was it that pulled the child's attention away, or why was it challenging for that child to take the test? And I'm gathering lots of diagnostic information simply from administering just a general academic test. One of the things that we do with dynamic assessment, as I practice it as an educator, is when I'm doing a dynamic assessment in this manner, and when I'm taking a class test, say a social studies test, I make sure that the child ultimately does understand the question, and that I work with the child in making sure they can answer the question completely and correctly. Of course, I have lots of annotation about what the process was, so it informs me later on about what did the child really know and what did they not know. There's a very important dimension to dynamic assessment here also. And you can have a child sit down to take a test that ultimately they should do very well on. But if for some reason they really struggle on the first question, they may shut down and they may decide, oh, I can't do this test, or I'm not going to do it. And again, we don't really know why the child performed poorly if we weren't there to see what the child's response was to the questions and so forth.
Right. Yeah, I'm thinking about, these dynamic assessments which you've described beautifully in terms of you would be giving these dynamic assessments as an educator, as someone who supports kids educationally, either as an educational therapist, which you have educational specialists who work with you. Is this something that teachers would do as an accommodation, or would a child be permitted to do a dynamic assessment with, a learning specialist like yourself?
Sure. Yes. And so, of course, you and I have both been classroom teachers, and we know how difficult it is to provide the amount of individual attention we ideally would like to. If a teacher doesn't have the time, and it's hard to find the time to work individually, we do want for the learning specialist at the school, the resource teacher, whatever individual who is providing support to do the test together with the student. So, and when we provide, say, a teacher aide or a tutor, some basic guidelines on how we approach dynamic assessment, certainly with regard to how I'm speaking about it now, it can be relatively easy to do. And I frequently encourage, when possible, when I'm working on IEP accommodations, that when possible, for as many tests as possible to be done via dynamic assessment. Again, it requires time and a special location and so forth. But dynamic assessment, in my view, is a reasonable and appropriate request for many children's IEPs, individual education plans at school, because one, taking a test, first of all, can be very traumatizing for some children. The other issue is it can be counterproductive in that we ask the child to take a test, but say it is on some principles of science or social studies, which they may actually have a gift for. But if the test requires reading, and if the child has very slowly emerging reading skills, they may not be able to demonstrate their knowledge of what was taught. And the experience of taking the test is negative and perhaps to some extent traumatizing. But we also don't know if the child simply had not learned the principles in the science class or social studies class that they needed to learn, unless we provide the test dynamically, interactively, with the aid of a teacher, a tutor, a teacher aide, a learning specialist.
And when you're doing the dynamic assessment, I'm familiar with Lev Vygotsky's work. And he's very big on providing feedback. Are you providing feedback during the test? So for example, if a child is completing a question and there's two parts, and I see this a lot of times with kids who have attention issues, where it's describe X and then give an example of, and they describe X, but they don't see the second part, which is give the example. Do you provide feedback while they're taking the test saying, I saw that you did the first part, but don't forget to do the second part? Are you providing them that guidance and those prompts during the assessment?
You certainly can. And that's called the interactionist. I don't like using technical terms but there is an approach to dynamic assessment called the interactionist. You interact constantly in an ongoing way. The other approach, again, I'm not a big fan of technical words, is called the interventionist, that you give the test like you traditionally give tests. You look at the results, you provide some new instruction, and then you give the child the test again. It's a little more traditional. It's test, teach, retest. But the interactionist approach is you're constantly interacting. So, and that's the way I approach it when I'm working with a child. Is I'm going to make sure the child understands the directions. I have them read them. Did they understand them, or could they read them? Read the question. Could they read it? Did they understand it? Do they know how to arrive at the right answer, whether it's a math question or a science or social studies? Did they need prompts or reminders? How did we get to the answer? And this informs us a lot about what were the child's capacities? How do they manage the demands of a test? What kind of prompts did they need to recall information they may have had? Or did they simply not have the information? Which tells us something too. If a child's been in a class for weeks or months and still hasn't learned certain principles of science or social studies or English or math, it tells us a little bit about how we need to change what we're doing from an instructional standpoint for that child in the classroom.
Absolutely. And I can definitely see where that would be beneficial, particularly the notes that you're taking as you're observing the child. Because, even when we're doing formal assessments, those behavioral observations are so important because, like you said at the beginning, kids can arrive at the same score on a test for very different reasons, right? And kind of their approach and that qualitative information is just as important as the quantitative information that you get from the tests themselves. And I can think of another example where that dynamic approach would be helpful. Particularly, I'm thinking again about kids who have these attention issues where I've seen kids do a page of math calculations. Some of them are simple addition, some of them are subtraction, some of them are multiplication, but they're all on the same page and they don't pay attention to the sign. So they say 3 plus 2, but they subtract instead of adding, and they do that numerous times on the page. But I can imagine in a dynamic assessment, if you're bringing their attention to the fact that, I see you added here instead of subtracting, then they can self-correct immediately. And now it's not that they conceptually didn't understand subtraction. It's that they were not paying attention to the symbol, which was the sign.
So true. And I too have had that experience. Suddenly realizing a child confused a plus sign with a multiplication sign. And if I hadn't been there to redirect or provide a prompt, the child would have made multiple mistakes throughout the course of the test. And a big problem we have with children, especially children with learning and behavioral differences, they make a lot of mistakes. And when children are repeating the same mistake, it actually reinforces that concept. In other words, the wrong thing, the misinformation gets imprinted quite deeply. And so this is why we call it immediate corrective feedback when we're working with children. If we identify they're going down the wrong path, we want to intervene, and we want to provide opportunities for repetition. So it's immediate corrective feedback and repetition. So when I'm working with a child and I'm assessing some basic capacity, so I will often start with a child. I'll say, can you make the number 1? And they'll make a 1 as a stick, and that's pretty easy. But other numbers like 2 or 3 or 4, they can begin to make them different ways or reverse them. And we want to be there to capture that confusion. Say, good job with your 2, but let's turn it around so it goes this way. And now let's practice it 2 or 3 or 4 times correctly. We want immediate corrective feedback and repetitive conditioning so that we can begin to flush out some of these incorrect conclusions about how letters or numbers are formed, or even meanings of words or sounds of letters or letter combinations, which can get pretty hardwired if we're not there to correct and to provide reinforcement for the correct understanding.
Mm-hmm. And it seems that when you're doing these dynamic assessments, you're really getting at, the why. And I always, when I talk about kids who are struggling, that's where the information is. It's in the why are they struggling. Now you know why they didn't do well on that test, right? Is it because they didn't know the information? They couldn't read the instructions. They could read them, but they couldn't understand them. They weren't paying attention. And now you have information that helps you to support them in a bigger way. So you're taking all of these notes during the dynamic assessment. What do you do with all of that information that you have? And because it seems like it's such important data to get to educators and teachers in the classroom.
Well, there's a lot of really, really rich and important things we learn. One is, how does this child understand taking a test? And do they understand the importance of directions, or reading directions twice, or annotating, underlining directions, or questions? How do they break it down and how do they read it? So we can understand something as simple as, what is their approach to taking a test? And those are skills that will actually generalize to other types of tests. But the other one that's more specific to the subject, what is it they misunderstood about, say we're studying the U.S. Constitution and not understanding that the first 10 amendments are the Bill of Rights, thinking of the Bill of Rights as something entirely independent of the Constitution or of the amendments. And this child didn't understand that the first 10 amendments of the U.S. Constitution are called the Bill of Rights. And you finding ways to begin to clarify misunderstandings and think about what we're going to do in terms of our instructional practices at another time. There's a very closely related area to dynamic assessment, has to do with writing. So we've all worked with really bright, motivated kids who have to write. or have to write on a topic. But left to their own devices, it's not going to be a productive experience, and it may even be very painful or traumatizing for some kids left alone with a task to write a paragraph or an essay that they are expected to complete for homework or in class or anywhere else, but they simply don't have capacities required to write. So, and again, we want to engage in a highly collaborative, interactive process. And we can actually call this dynamic assessment because while we're working with the child on the writing assignment, we can see how much help do they really need. Say there's a topic. The topic is, what is global warming? How do you describe its impact on the world? Or whatever. A child might be very confused by that prompt. So we want to engage a child in a discussion about the prompt. And we want to talk about global warming. Is it the ground? Is it the air? Is it the ocean? Is it all three? We want to begin to clarify and build understanding. And we want to begin to gather the child's thoughts. We want to guide them towards other ideas. We want to begin to build a construct that they can then begin to work with us in terms of generating written words about the topic. And this requires a very high level of carefully scaffolded support with writing. Of course, questions of authorship is the big issue when we're providing this kind of help to children who have a writing assignment at school and need to work with their writing specialist or their parent or a tutor or a therapist. And what I encourage, first of all, is that we have a lot of clarity with the school. If the child does not have an IEP or a 504, where we could also make this one of the accommodations, that the child will be allowed to engage in writing as a highly collaborative, interactive, co-constructive process, which in fact is not only the best way to help a child complete a writing assignment, it's actually one of the best ways to help a child become a more skilled writer, because they can engage in writing in a meaningful, constructive way that in time they can begin to do with increasing levels of independence. The key is to establish that we're going to engage in the completion of writing assignment in this collaborative, interactive way, and we're going to collect all of our notes that we generate while we work with a child in this way so that the teacher can understand how we arrived at the final product. Much like getting back to our social studies test that I may have done one-on-one with the student, when I get back to the teacher and say, this student took this social studies test with me, and I didn't need to provide that child with any prompts, and that child got all of the questions correct. That's a legitimate A. That's a legitimate 100% correct. Now remember, certainly the way I approach this from an educator's standpoint and a practitioner, I'm going to work with a child to make sure all of the questions are answered and they're answered correctly. But if I have a ton of notes on my copy of the test, I can show that to the teacher. And so if the teacher does need to arrive at a letter grade or a number score, they can use my notes to extrapolate what the score should be. And, Dr. Wilson, I'm wondering, in your own work, you use a lot of very formal psychometric assessments. And I'm wondering if you've ever had situations where you're using a formal structured psychometric assessment, but discovered that to use it, you might have to provide support or clarification above and beyond what the manual might allow you to do. Have you encountered a situation like that?
Yeah, I would say that it happens very often. And, when we're giving these standardized tests, you have to give them in the same way to every child because you're comparing them to a normative sample. You're comparing them to other children who have performed the same test under the same conditions. So you can't deviate from how they administered the test to the normative sample. So if they gave instructions in this way, at this pace, they gave this one prompt and no other prompts, then you have to give it in the exact same way. Otherwise, you can't interpret the score. That being said, you can administer it in that way. And then what I'll do is I will administer it the way that you're supposed to administer it. But if I observe something during the process that suggests that the child may have been able to do it with prompts, or if the instructions were presented in a different way, then I will do that after I administer the test. And then I will provide that qualitative information when I'm writing the report, right? And so an example would be, there's a test that we give that is part of the measure of intellectual functioning, where children have to look at a two-dimensional picture, and they have three-dimensional blocks, and they have to make the blocks look like the picture. And for some kids, it takes them longer, and they may have 2 minutes to do it. And so you have to stop them after the 2 minutes. And what I will do, if I see a kid who's really close to getting it, I will stop them after the 2 minutes, and that will be their score. But then I will let them continue to see what is their approach, how long will it actually take them to solve it. And then what I'll often see is that they are able to solve it, but they can't solve it within the time limit that is required for the test. But that's good qualitative information, because that means that they do have good visual, spatial, and visual perception skills. They just can't complete that task within a particular time limit. And so I provide that information in the context of a report. And I might say, this is the child's score, but given more time, this child would be able to perform above expected levels on this test. And so that also provides information about how to support this child in the classroom and in other settings.
Wow, that's great. That's a great example of being interactive and dynamic and getting more information. And it probably makes the experience more positive for the child too. Ultimately, we're trying to help children develop a stronger, healthier internal script about who they are and what they're capable of. And this is why very often when we're working with children with learning and behavioral differences, if they're taking tests all the time and they're doing really horribly all the time, all we're doing is reinforcing this notion that they're not good learners. And we need to understand that tests, almost by definition, measure a fairly narrow band of capacities. And when we have an opportunity to help children understand that under other circumstances, or with the right level of support, or with a little more time, or a different process or approach, they do have the ability to manage these demands, to perform well, and to ultimately strengthen their internal script about who they are and what they're capable of. And indeed, one of the beauties of dynamic assessment, we learn about the potential the child has for learning, where with static testing, we don't always. We don't really know where the potential was. And that is a function of test bias. At the test, there are limits to how well certain children can do on certain tests, because there are many different capacities a child needs to be good at to perform well on tests, to bring their attention to the task, for sustain their attention, to regulate their emotions effectively, to manage the task of taking a test, to think about the language flexibly enough that they can understand what the question means, and then generate the right answer. And if they have to write it in words, organize their thoughts sufficiently and choose words to then write down. And that's a lot. And when a student has slowly emerging academic capacities, reading, writing, spelling, or attentional capacities, or information processing capacities, if children continue to experience struggle and challenge and failure, unfortunately, that can often become how they perceive themselves, as a failure, as someone who can't do well. And we really need to think about how we can change the demands we place on children such that they can perform better, we can learn more, and we can create a healthier, positive internal script for that child about what their capacities are in the long term, in the grand scheme of things. Because very often one small episode can be very devastating to some children if it results in a failure.
And that collaborative approach, helps in so many different ways. One, you're building connection with the learner as they're performing this task, as they're completing this assessment, because you're doing it with them, right? And then also you're getting information about them, about how they learn, which you can share with them, which can be very empowering to that child to know, I noticed that you do so much better when I give you a little prompt or I give you an example of something related to what you have to do. And that can actually help them in other areas. And so it seems like it's also an opportunity to model learning, model how you take a test, model how you structure an essay for the child so that they eventually can do that on their own with less interaction and less input from you.
Exactly. And that's really the beauty of dynamic assessment, whether it's some formal level of testing or something a little less formal, say helping a child with an essay prompt or any other aspect of instruction, that when we approach it interactively, collaboratively, dynamically, we learn more as the educator, as a clinician, as a practitioner. We make the experience more edifying for the child. We help them develop skills they might not otherwise develop left to their own devices. And this is why I'm really excited to see so many people beginning to use dynamic assessment, not only in terms of assessing, but also as an instructional approach used at school. And it's being used more widely and in different contexts. And it's a really exciting new tool in our toolbox as educators. And frankly, parents too. A parent can use a homework assignment dynamically to get a sense of what it is their child knows or doesn't know about what it is they're expected to learn at school. And again, we would probably want the parent to generate some notes about the support that was provided while doing the assignment. But we don't want for a parent to miss the opportunity to help in a meaningful way, to help in a way that is going to make a difficult or perhaps even traumatizing assignment. Doing something you don't know how to do can be traumatizing. And for the parent to learn about what the experience was like, to generate notes to provide to the teacher or a tutor or an ed therapist or anyone else working with a child individually.
And again, I can just see that information that the parent provides, helping the educational specialist, the educational therapist, and the teacher better support that child moving forward.
Without a doubt. And that's the goal, really. We want to help the child and understand that for some students, static testing or traditional testing is unfair testing because it makes the assumption that every child comes to the test experience with the same set of resources and tools, but they don't. And to make adjustments and accommodations is fair, it's reasonable, and most importantly, it's critical to promote capacities to help children learn and to develop within the child an internal script that, I can manage. When I get the help I need, I can be successful. I can learn. Maybe there's hope for me after all.
Dr. Franklin, this has been a very informative conversation. I think a lot of parents, a lot of educators are going to hear this and hopefully do things differently at home and in the classroom. If parents want to find out more or educators want to know more about dynamic assessment, what is the best way for them to reach you to learn more?
Sure. I love hearing from folks. I always return emails. You can reach me at danielfranklinphd.com. It's all one, so just danielfranklinphd.com. And I really welcome the opportunity to hear at any point in time, whether it's as they're listening to this podcast or the next day or the next week or the next month or year. I really do look forward to listening or hearing from your listeners. And it's been a real pleasure to be speaking with you again today, Dr. Wilson.
Wonderful. And I'll be sure to put all of your information in the show notes. Thank you again for being here a second time.
My pleasure.
It was so great having Dr. Franklin back on the podcast, and I'm just thrilled to have him as a member of our Child Nexus community. Our goal is just to connect parents and educators with resources about kids who think and learn differently, and to connect parents with professionals who can help their kids thrive. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.